let's go one more time to this initial page here, just to cover what the actual rendering side looks like for a few of the other UI control types. Again, now we have a title of homeowner's insurance quote that's being rendered based upon the title of this particular container underneath the root entity being UI. I have created a unique ID for each of these UI controls. And one of those UI controls is merely a read-only text string here that does not have any value being solicited from the end user. So obviously there's nothing to accrue based upon that, but it is a UI control in and of itself, this one being of the type read-only text. This is a UI control type with a label filled out to be street address, a value assigned to be 123 Main Street. Value, when I use it to render the UI control, will simply render as the default value, as kind of the placeholder here, pre-written out. Whereas if I don't provide any value, when I define the creation of a unit, for example, like we did here, there's no predefined value. So if I leave it as is, then the value will then be retained as simply the value which will be allocated into the assigned field name for this particular path to data. So street address would be assigned as 123 Main Street in the case of me not changing anything. But let's say we changed it to Center Street. Now we'll see how the value underneath street address will be assigned over on the right-hand side in the accrued data as street address equals 123 Center Street as opposed to Main Street. Carrying on down here, again, there's my unit being rendered as a text data type, but without a value being predefined. A postcode being defined as a number data type, and I'm actually saying data type, but that's not quite right. What I'm doing at this particular stage when I'm rendering this field name for postcode or that UI control to solicit from the end user the postcode, I'm telling the front end to capture some value that will be numeric and place that value underneath a field name of postcode. Now, in order to do anything with that, for example, maybe I want to create rules which will evaluate based upon postcode what a given rate might be. If I want to do that, then obviously in Corticon, in order to operate upon any data, we need to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Corticon has to have some knowledge of what we're referring to by quote dot postcode in order to do anything with it. So we can create UI controls that will be retained underneath this accrued data, yet not used by those rules. It'll just be ignored entirely. Whereas with typically what we'll want to do is capture all of these different field names as actual elements within our rule vocabulary. So you'll recall how postcode was actually an attribute underneath property in the rules in the previous video, and that's exactly what we're doing here. We're essentially populating out the input payload that we had in order to capture all the necessary inputs to finally produce that quote with the deductibles, premiums, etc. for this insurance quote. Finally, down here, we again see that I have a more complex set of examples for, or a more complex multiple choice drop down with all of my different states. But ultimately, that will just be rendered as a, this will just be rendered as a drop down with those fields and retained underneath state name.